What would you do if you had to face the family that moved on without you? As I stepped through the doors of the chapel that morning, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Chatter halted abruptly, glances flicked my way, and heads swiveled to get a better look. A few folks let out audible gasps, while others murmured my name as if it carried a hex. It had been well over 12 years since most of these people had laid eyes on me. And yet, here I stood, uninvited, at my ex-husband's funeral, like a sudden squall nobody saw coming. Daniel Thornton, the man I once vowed to love forever, rested in an open mahogany casket, framed by creamy lilies and gentle piano melodies. His second wife, Carla, sat in the front row, delicately patting her eyes with a tissue she barely touched. Beside her were my girls, Lily and Sophia, both refusing to meet my eyes, as if I were some specter from their past. I knew I didn't belong here anymore. This place hadn't been mine for years, but I wasn't here for their approval. I came because despite all the pain he caused, Daniel had once been my everything, and a deep, stubborn part of me needed to close this chapter, to witness the end. As I made my way down the side aisle, slow and deliberate, people leaned closer to each other, their whispers buzzing like static. I caught snippets. Is that really her? Why would she show up after all this time? I didn't let it rattle me. I held my chin up, shoulders squared, and slid into a pew near the back, neatly draping my jacket beside me. It felt like I was on display in a courtroom, but shame wasn't part of my baggage. They didn't know the full story, most never had. The pastor spoke, tears flowed, and memories I'd shoved deep down came flooding back. Our first snowy Christmas, the cozy home we built in Savannah, the girls wobbling on their first bikes, and the heavy, choking quiet that defined our final years. Just when I thought the murmurs might fade, an attorney rose at the podium. He was a lanky man in a navy suit, clutching a leather briefcase, his voice steady yet commanding. I've been instructed to share a portion of Daniel Thornton's final will and testament, he announced. A hush fell, long enough to make every spine in the room stiffen. He opened his folder, cleared his throat, and began reading. To Eleanor Grayson. Every head snapped toward me in sync. Every pair of eyes, including those of my daughters, pinned me in place. Before we dive deeper, what would you say to Eleanor if you were in Sophia's shoes? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and hit that subscribe button for more gripping tales. Silence gripped the room. Not a single blink. In that suspended moment, I realized the true story was only just unfolding. Before betrayal turned my name into a hush scandal, I was just Eleanor. A devoted wife, a nurturing mom, a woman who poured her heart into crafting a life, not chasing fleeting dreams. Daniel and I were married for 27 years, and for most of them, I believed we had something solid, something holy. We crossed paths in our early 30s. I was an art major, hands smudged with charcoal, head full of wild ideas. He was a new business grad, overflowing with drive and big plans. His world was all crisp lines and tough calls. Mine was a vibrant mess of hues and imagination. We complemented each other, or at least I thought we did. We tied the knot in a simple ceremony one April evening in Savannah. The chapel was quaint, the cake came from a local bakery, but our laughter felt like kids dreaming up adventures in a backyard fort. We settled into a cozy one-bedroom apartment above a coffee shop, where I sketched and painted while Daniel launched his financial advisory firm from our dining nook. We scraped by on canned soup and lofty ambitions, always swearing that better days were coming, and eventually they did. Daniel's business soared. Clients poured in, and so did the cash. He started wearing suits that cost more than our old monthly rent. I stayed home, raising Lily and Sophia, dabbling in art, mostly for friends, sometimes for local shops, and often just to hold on to myself. Our Savannah house, one I helped design, was our haven. The backyard burst with azaleas, their untamed beauty my favorite thing. The walls glowed with warm, earthy shades, every corner holding a piece of us. Framed baby pictures, the girls' finger paint masterpieces, Daniel's first industry plaque, and a lopsided clay cat Sophia crafted in 3rd grade. We weren't showy, we were grounded. My world revolved around my family for years. I shuttled the girls to school, packed their lunches with little notes, and chaired PTA fundraisers. I taught them to whip up cookies from scratch, to say sorry with heart, and to stand tall when life pushed them. When Daniel rolled in late, I kept his dinner warm. When he jetted off for work, I slipped encouraging notes into his suitcase. He didn't always notice, but I didn't care about applause. I did it because I loved him, because we were weaving a life together. Looking back, I can see the quiet imbalance that simmered beneath it all. Daniel was the shining star of our family's success, the one everyone noticed. I was the steady backbone, invisible but essential, and I was okay with that. I didn't crave the spotlight. I believed in teamwork, not showmanship. Our girls grew up, and Daniel's firm expanded. We traded our practical minivan for a pair of sleek SUVs. Took vacations to Italy, Belize, even a cruise through the Norwegian fjords. To the outside world, we were the picture of triumph. Neighbors were jealous. Friends sought our secrets. And I, in my understated way, took pride in the life we'd carved out. But now, I wonder if I mistook stability for closeness. Daniel grew distant, and I patched the gaps with excuses. I told myself he was just swamped, that it was a hectic phase, that he was grinding for our family. Deep down, I didn't want to face what I sensed. The man I married was morphing into a stranger, one who no longer truly saw me. There were no blowout fights, no ultimatums, just a slow, creeping stillness that settled between us like fog over a lake. I'd ask about his day, and he'd give a curt nod. I'd share a new sketch, and he'd glance up, mutter "looks good," and dive back into his emails. He wasn't mean, just absent. Physically there, but mentally miles away. Even then, I didn't think we were doomed. I figured this was just a rough patch, the kind all long marriages weather. I convinced myself love could be subtle, that after so many years, ease was enough. I clung to that hope like a life raft. I thought we were secure, that we'd conquered the toughest storms. I had no clue that while I was nurturing our home, Daniel was already 1 foot out the door. The first hint of trouble didn't arrive with a shouting match or a slammed door. It came dressed in silk and champagne, on an evening meant to toast Daniel's latest corporate award. We'd been invited to a swanky gala in the heart of the city, complete with a live jazz quartet, trays of gourmet appetizers, and ice sculptures shaped like the company's logo. Daniel was being honored with a prestigious award for exceptional business leadership, and I'd spent all afternoon getting ready for the occasion. I slipped into a deep sapphire gown he'd once raved about years ago, paired with the delicate gold necklace he gifted me for our 18th anniversary. I even styled my hair just the way he preferred, loose waves, no heavy products. I wanted to look refined, not for the crowd, but for him, to make him proud. When we arrived at the gala, Daniel quickly drifted away from me. I told myself it was just business. He had to mingle, shake hands, work the room. It was his moment after all. I lingered by the cocktail bar, sipping a glass of Chardonnay, offering polite smiles to unfamiliar faces, watching him from afar as he charmed the room with laughs, hearty backslaps, and raised glasses. He had a way of drawing people in, at events like that. Everyone orbited around him, and I was fine staying on the sidelines. I always had been. But then it happened. A senior VP from a collaborating company approached Daniel, who was chatting with a small group nearby. I stepped closer, ready to introduce myself with a warm smile and an outstretched hand. That's when Daniel waved toward me offhandedly and said, "Oh, that's Eleanor. She keeps me grounded." He tossed it out with a light laugh, like it was a private quip. The group chuckled. I forced a smile, though it felt hollow. My hand, halfway extended, hovered awkwardly before dropping back to my side. She keeps me grounded. Not his wife. Not the woman who stood by him from the start. Not even his partner. Just some anchor to keep him steady, like a life coach or a potted plant. It was a fleeting comment, barely a blip in the bustling ballroom, but it sank into my chest like a heavy stone. For the rest of the night, I kept up appearances. I clinked glasses, smiled for photos, and clapped as he delivered his acceptance speech. He thanked his colleagues, his mentors, even his late mother. My name never crossed his lips. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that he might have thought mentioning me in such a corporate setting would feel out of place. But even as I reasoned it away, a chill settled in my heart. In the car on the way home, I wanted to talk. Not to point fingers, but to understand. At a stoplight, I turned to him softly and said, "Did you really mean what you said tonight, about me just keeping you grounded?" He didn't glance up from his phone, scrolling through a flood of congratulatory messages. "It was just a joke, Al," he muttered. "Don't take it so personally." Personally, that word started trailing me like a ghost. Whenever I raised something that stung, something that made me feel unseen or brushed off, I was taking things too personally. It was his go-to defense, a way to dodge without really engaging. And each time he said it, I felt myself shrink a little more inside. The days after the gala were subdued. He went back to his office. I fell back into the routine of home, folding laundry, grocery shopping, keeping things tidy. But something had changed. I stopped peering out the window when he stayed late. I stopped whipping up fancy dinners. I stopped asking how his day went. Instead, I started noticing subtle shifts, not glaring red flags but small nagging details. His scent was different, new cologne sharper. He dressed more polished, even for quick trips to the store. His phone was always glued to his hand. He laughed more during client calls than he did with me over dinner. Still, I didn't confront him. I didn't want to be the suspicious wife, jumping to conclusions. I told myself it was just a phase, a demanding season at work, a temporary lull. We'd weather tougher times. But I couldn't shake that night, that casual remark, that fleeting moment that whispered. No, warned, that I was no longer the heart of his world. I just hadn't yet grasped that someone else had already taken my place. After that gala, it was like the air in our home shifted. Not dramatically, not with a crash, but gradually, like a house sinking slightly off kilter. To outsiders, nothing looked different. We kept our routines, shared a bed, sat down for dinner most evenings. But beneath the surface, something vital had gone quiet. Daniel started coming home later and later. Sometimes he didn't come home at all, citing client dinners, urgent meetings, or last-minute business trips that sprang up without notice. I stopped pressing for details. When I did, he'd let out a heavy sigh and say, "It's just work, Eleanor. You know how it goes." But I didn't anymore. I used to be part of his work world. I'd proofread his early proposals, sit quietly in the audience during his presentations, even press his shirts before big investor meetings. Now I was shut out. He didn't need me in the spaces we once shared. One night, I went all out cooking his favorite, rosemary-crusted pork with glazed parsnips and creamy mashed potatoes. I set the table with candles and uncorked a bottle of Merlot. It was our 28th anniversary. He didn't show. No call, no text, nothing. I waited until 1 a.m., the food cold, the candles flickering low. I snuffed them out one by one, perched on the edge of our bed in my favorite dress, staring at the door like some naive girl. The next morning, he strolled in at 6:45 a.m., still in yesterday's clothes. No apology, just a breezy. "Didn't you get my text?" Dinner ran late, so I stayed at the hotel. There was no text. I wanted to yell, to demand answers. Instead, I nodded, shuffled to the kitchen, and poured his coffee the way he liked it. No sugar, just a dash of cream. That's what it turned into, silent surrender. Not because I was spineless, but because I was exhausted. Exhausted from chasing fleeting moments of warmth. Exhausted from voicing my pain only to be met with dismissive sighs or blank stares. Every time I tried to speak up, he made me feel like I was coming unhinged, overreacting to nothing. He started slipping in subtle jabs in front of the girls. One evening at dinner, Sophia mentioned wanting to defer college for a year to travel, and I encouraged her to follow what sparked joy. Daniel smirked. This is what happens when kids hang around their mom too much and not enough with discipline. Lily snickered. Sophia shifted uncomfortably. I bit my tongue. I was losing them too. The girls, once my little shadows, my pride, had gravitated toward Daniel. Maybe because he'd become the cool parent, whisking them off on snowboarding trips, and gifting them the latest gadgets. I was the one nagging about balanced meals and homework deadlines. They didn't see how he iced me out. They didn't hear the way he shut me down when we were alone. To them, I was just irritable, overly sensitive, perpetually drained. He started spending entire weekends away for business. Even when he was home, his eyes stayed glued to his phone. I'd try to start a conversation, and he'd respond without looking up, my words hitting him like background noise. It wasn't just the major moments Daniel missed. It was the countless small ones that slipped away. He no longer brushed against me as we passed in the hallway. He stopped whispering goodnight before we turned out the lights. He completely overlooked that I'd started leading painting workshops at the local rec center. He never asked how they were going, or about anything in my life, for that matter. Some nights, I'd perch on the edge of the bathtub, muffling my tears in a folded towel so the house stayed quiet. Not because he was loud or cruel. He never raised his voice. It was worse. He made me invisible bit by bit, with such precision that I started questioning if I'd ever truly been seen at all. I'd gaze into the mirror and ask myself, when did I stop being his partner? When did I stop being me? Yet I stayed. I held tight to the promises we made. I believed in cycles, in weathering tough seasons. I kept thinking if I just poured in more effort, he'd find his way back to me. But love can't be shouldered by one person alone. And I was already carrying the weight of our entire life. It all came to a head on a lazy Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that should have felt warm and simple, if not holy. We were throwing a modest backyard gathering to celebrate Lily's engagement. Nothing over the top, just a handful of close friends and family, with trays of appetizers and wine glasses clinking to the soft strum of acoustic music from a Bluetooth speaker on the deck. I'd spent the whole week getting ready, shining the silverware, arranging the patio table with care, and picking out vibrant blooms from the farmer's market. I used to love these moments, not for the role of hostess, but because I cherished making people feel valued, cherished. To me, happiness lived in the little touches. Daniel didn't offer to pitch in, but I didn't ask. By then, I'd stopped hoping he'd see the effort it took to create something meaningful. He showed up that morning in pressed slacks and a teal polo clean-shaven, flashing a smile like he hadn't skipped every other family dinner that month. Lily wrapped him in a tight hug, radiant with joy, and for a moment, I saw the dad she'd always idolized. Sophia arrived soon after, quieter, always observing. I kept busy in the kitchen, ferrying out cheese boards and bite-sized tarts, chuckling on cue, mingling as needed, and steering clear of Daniel's orbit. We'd mastered the dance of sharing space without truly connecting, but I wasn't ready for what came next, or how easily it would cut through the fragile dignity I still clung to. As the afternoon wound down, someone clinked a glass for a toast. It was Ethan, Lily's fiancé, a kind-hearted, slightly nervous guy who adored her. He shared a few heartfelt words about love and family, then turned to Daniel and me. And a huge thank you to Mr. and Mrs. Thornton for hosting this. You two are such a remarkable couple. The group applauded. I managed to smile, even as that familiar ache tightened in my gut. Daniel lifted his glass with a smirk. Well, if Lily ends up half as sharp as her mom, and maybe twice as level-headed, I'll call that a victory. A ripple of laughter followed, not loud but sharp enough to bite. A few stifled giggles, including one from Carla, yes, that Carla, his coworker, invited as a +1. She stood just behind him, sipping a spritzer. Her lips painted the same coral shade I used to wear. I froze. It wasn't just the words that stung. It was how effortlessly he delivered them, the rehearsed wit, the casual performance. I was reduced to a prop in his narrative, the high-strung wife, the overly emotional homemaker who should just be thankful for a nod. I glanced at Sophia. She looked down at her plate. Then I did something unexpected. I quietly excused myself from the table and slipped back into the house, not with a scene or tears but calmly, deliberately. I climbed the stairs, sat on the edge of our bed, and stared into the dresser mirror. My makeup had dulled. A strand of hair had slipped loose. I looked weary, older than I felt. Downstairs, their laughter carried on. The music hummed. I didn't cry. Instead, something shifted inside me. Not anger, not grief, but something sharper, colder, like the crack of ice underfoot in January. That evening, after the guests had left and Daniel was sprawled on the couch with a glass of bourbon, flipping through channels, I approached him calmly. "Why did you say that today in front of everyone?" I asked. He barely glanced up. "It was just a joke, Eleanor. Stop making everything so personal." There it was again, so personal. I nodded. That night, I slept in the spare bedroom, claiming a migraine. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't check on me. He was already gone, just not in name. What I didn't see then was that this moment, this small public jab wrapped in humor, would become the breaking point, the line I couldn't uncross, the quip everyone chuckled at but I'd never forget. It was when I realized the man I'd built a life with no longer respected me, and hadn't for a long time. It didn't end with a screaming match. It ended in silence. The day Daniel asked me to leave, or rather suggested it as he phrased it, was unremarkable in every other way. The sky was bright, the coffee maker hummed on schedule, the neighbor's dog yapped as usual. I was folding laundry, humming softly, when he walked into the room and said it, as casually as if he were noting we were low on eggs. "I think some space would be good for both of us, Elle." I stood there, clutching one of his iron dress shirts, my hand still. My heart didn't shatter in that moment. The pain was real, but it wasn't a shock. It was as if I'd spent the past year quietly steeling myself for this moment. Still, hearing those words out loud felt like swallowing shards of ice. "Space," I echoed. "You're saying I should leave?" Daniel gave a nonchalant shrug. "No need to make it a big deal, Eleanor. We're just not in sync anymore. We haven't been for a while. We're living separate lives." He didn't admit to loving someone else, though I knew the truth. He didn't name her, but I'd caught whiffs of her scent on his jackets. A cloying coconut fragrance I'd never choose. There was no trace of remorse or even frustration in his voice, just a cool detachment, like he was canceling a subscription. The girls weren't around to see it. Lily had recently moved in with her fiancé, Ethan, and Sophia was off at university. No one was there to witness the quiet collapse of my marriage, just the two of us standing in the home we'd built, surrounded by the relics of a life we'd both neglected. I gave a slow nod. "Okay," I said, my voice steady. I didn't fight or plead or fling accusations. I didn't shatter a single dish. The calm I felt surprised even me. After years of being sidelined, dismissed, and gradually erased, I had no strength left to perform devastation for someone who'd long stopped noticing me. Over the next few days, I packed with care, not because I wanted to take much, but because I refused to leave in disarray. I gathered my sketchbooks, my grandmother's recipe journal, my paint supplies, and a worn easel. I left behind our wedding photos, the engraved champagne flutes from our anniversaries, and the fancy pots and pans I'd never used for the big family gatherings that never happened. When I broke the news to the girls, their responses were divided. Lily, always her father's shadow, didn't seem shocked. "Are you sure this is the right move, Mom?" she asked. "You always seemed unsettled." Unsettled. As if my heartache was just a passing mood. Sophia, though, broke into tears. She said she hadn't seen it coming, that she thought we were just hitting a bumpy stretch. I didn't set her straight. It wasn't her fault she missed the clues. Daniel had always been a master at masking absence as preoccupation. Within a week, I signed a lease for a modest apartment in Augusta. It was a far cry from our Savannah house, compact, hushed, with faded linoleum floors and chipped paint in the stairwell. But it was mine. For the first time in years, the silence around me wasn't thick with unmet expectations. It was pure, almost weightless. Some days I'd sprawl on the couch, staring at the ceiling, wondering what those decades had amounted to. Had I squandered my prime years loving someone who never truly reciprocated? Had I lingered too long out of obligation, fear, or a fading hope that the man I married would resurface? Other days I felt a faint flicker beneath the sorrow. Not happiness, not yet, but room. Room to breathe, to reflect, to rediscover the woman I was before my life became a footnote to someone else's dreams. I kept the details to myself, not out of shame, but because I didn't want to explain my choice to people who'd never bothered to ask about my pain in the first place. Let them assume I left on a whim. Let them think I was too fragile, too distant, too complex. The truth was straightforward. I walked away because staying meant fading away completely, and I wasn't ready to disappear. Rock bottom isn't always a crashing descent. Sometimes it's a quiet corner. A solitary moment in the supermarket, tears blurring the labels on soup cans. A dim kitchen with a single mug drying by the sink. A phone that never rings back. That's where I lived for the first 8 months after leaving Daniel. My Augusta apartment was tiny, with 2 small bedrooms and a creaky furnace that rattled like loose change at night. The walls seemed to hum with the groans of old pipes, yet the silence always found a way to creep in. I spruced it up with what little I'd brought. A few framed snapshots of the girls as kids, some thrift store chairs, and a handful of glass figurines I'd snagged at a flea market to keep the shelves from looking so bare. But nothing could fill the hollow ache in my chest. Mornings were the toughest. I'd wake up and for a fleeting second forget I was alone. My hand would drift across the bed, touching the cold, empty sheets where Daniel used to sleep, even in those last years when he barely acknowledged me. The absence had a presence all its own. When reality settled in, it didn't slam me. It seeped, like rain through a leaky roof, steady and unyielding. The girls checked in now and then, mostly Sophia. Lily's calls were short, perfunctory, like ticking a box. "Just seeing how you're doing, Mom," she'd say. I'd fib, claiming I was thriving, loving the independence, diving back into my art. None of it was true, not yet. I took a part-time gig as a front desk clerk at a chiropractic office downtown. The pay was modest, but it kept my head above water. I sorted appointment logs, booked adjustments, and smiled like I meant it. My coworkers were kind enough, but I didn't connect with them. I felt older than them, not because of years, but because of the weight I carried, an invisible burden they couldn't relate to. Some nights I skipped dinner. Others, I dozed off on the couch with the TV droning old sitcoms, just to avoid the empty bedroom. There were evenings I'd flip through old photo albums, tracing the edges of pictures that once held meaning. A snowy holiday morning, a school recital, Daniel and me on our honeymoon. We looked content. Maybe we were. Or maybe I was just naive. The worst day came when I stumbled across Daniel's picture online. I was skimming a local news site during my lunch break when his face flashed across the screen. Thornton and Reed Properties hosts annual fundraising gala. There he was, arms slung around Carla, both beaming like a polished power couple. She wore that same garish lipstick, a bubblegum pink that screamed artificial. And there, right beside them, stood Lily and Sophia. It felt like being wiped out of existence in real time. They'd posed for a new family portrait, without me. A sleek public image that screamed, "We're whole. We're happy. We've moved forward." I barely reached the office restroom before I collapsed. I sank to the floor in a stall, knees tucked to my chest, sobbing into my sweater sleeves. I wasn't crying because I wanted Daniel back. I was crying because it hit me. No one else seemed to miss me. I'd poured my life into others' needs. And when I stepped out of that role, I simply vanished. I wish I could say that moment sparked a revelation, that I dried my eyes and swore to rise like a firebird from the ashes. It wasn't an instant transformation. At first, I went home, wrapped myself in a second-hand Afghan and murmured, "You're still here," again and again, as if coaxing myself to believe I hadn't vanished with my marriage. Rock bottom wasn't a loud crash. It was a lingering hum that made me question if I'd ever been more than the sum of what I gave to others. But sometimes, when you're that far down, you start to feel the earth beneath you again. That, I'd later realize, was the seed of something I hadn't known in years: quiet strength. In that stillness, something new began to take root. It happened on a Thursday, an unremarkable day, the kind that slips through memory without leaving a mark. I'd taken a half day off from the chiropractic office to tackle some dusty boxes in my apartment's storage nook. Not because I had a grand plan, but because the clutter felt like it was closing in, mirroring the weight I carried inside. I needed to face what I was still holding onto, in every sense. The boxes were marked in smudged ink: kitchen memories, Eleanor, art supplies, and one labeled simply Ben. That one stopped me cold. My brother Benjamin, or Ben, had died 2 years ago from a sudden stroke. He was the only family member who truly stood by me during the divorce, while others averted their eyes with polite distance. Ben asked the hard questions, listened without judgment. When Daniel walked out, Ben showed up with a bag of groceries, a bottle of Pinot, and a single line that still echoed, "You were always more than just his wife." I tugged the box to the kitchen table. Inside were odds and ends, screwdrivers, a couple of plaid shirts, and some blueprints for a birdhouse he never built. At the bottom, I found a yellow envelope slightly crumpled, with my name scrawled in his familiar handwriting, "Eleanor. Open when you're ready." My pulse quickened. I hesitated, cradling it like it might break apart. Inside was a brief note from Ben, and tucked beneath it, an older folded sheet, worn from being handled. I read Ben's words first. "Sis, I found this while clearing out your old place after the split. I didn't know when to hand it over. You were so shattered then. I couldn't bear to add to your pain, but this belongs to you. You deserve to know the whole truth." I unfolded the second page. It was a letter from Daniel, unaddressed, unstamped. Maybe something he wrote but never had the guts to send. The ink was faint, but the words cut sharp. I read it slowly, my eyes lingering on each sentence. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, I never found the strength to say this aloud. I've done things I can't undo, but leaving you the way I did haunts me most. I didn't leave because my love for you faded. I left because I despised the man I'd turned into. And you were a mirror to the person I used to be. You never demanded anything, yet I let you carry it all. You gave me a home, 2 incredible daughters, a life I didn't earn. I repaid you with distance, silence, and cowardice. Carla wasn't my salvation. She just didn't know the real me enough to see how far I'd fallen. You did, and that terrified me. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just need you to know you were never the flaw. You were always the brightest piece of my life." I sat in silence, the letter lying on the table like a whisper from a past life. Tears welled, but they didn't fall right away. I gazed out the window at the overcast Augusta sky, watching the breeze sway the pines. Deep inside, something broke open. For years, I'd believed I was the unseen one, the expendable one, the woman discarded for not being enough. Now here was Daniel admitting what I'd sensed but never dared trust. It wasn't about me. It never had been. I held that letter like a relic from a world I'd left behind, because that's what it was. It didn't erase the hurt or mend the wounds, but it gave me a truth I could hold on to, untainted by deflection, sarcasm, or silence. I slipped the letter into a simple wooden frame and placed it on a shelf, not to celebrate Daniel, but to mark a turning point, a stake in the ground that said, "This is where my story shifts." That night I picked up a paintbrush for the first time in ages, not to prove anything or create a masterpiece, but to let something flow through me that was mine alone. For the first time in years, I felt like I was stepping back into my own skin. Finding that letter changed something in me. Not overnight, not with a burst of epiphany. I didn't spring out of bed the next day brimming with purpose or radiating newfound confidence. But little by little, my perspective began to shift. The haze that had clouded my life for so long started to clear. Not in sweeping waves, but in gentle, fleeting moments. I began rising earlier, not out of obligation, but because I craved the calm of dawn. I'd crack open the windows, inhale the crisp Augusta air, and just listen to the chirping sparrows, the hum of distant cars, the rhythm of my own thoughts. The silence that once weighed on me now felt like possibility, a canvas for growth, for rediscovery, for reclaiming the parts of me buried under years of being his wife, their mother, the quiet one in the shadows. That framed letter sat on my shelf, Not as a tribute to Daniel's remorse, but as proof that I hadn't imagined my value. It had always been there. He just failed to see it until it was gone. With that truth in writing, something in me solidified. Not with bitterness but with resolve. I was laying a new foundation. I started writing in a journal again. At first, the words stumbled out, awkward and halting, but soon they flowed in raw, unpolished streams. I wrote about my girlhood, my marriage, my daughters, and the small joys I'd once claimed before they faded into someone else's story. Through those pages, I began to reconnect with myself. Not as a woman just trying to get by, but as someone ready to start anew. I stopped dyeing my hair. It might sound small, but for me it was freedom. For years, I'd sat in salons, hiding the silver strands to chase a youth for a man now buried in the suit he wore when we were young. I let the gray shine through, and to my surprise, I loved it. It didn't age me, it made me feel authentic, unapologetic, seen. On weekends, I went back to the art studio at the rec center where I used to teach. The first time I stepped inside, the smell of acrylics and wet clay nearly undid me. I hadn't realized how much I missed the chaos of creation, the freedom to experiment, to make something that didn't need to be flawless, just mine. I began leading a watercolor workshop for women over 55 at the rec center. Most of them weren't there to master painting but to feel like they had a place, like their presence mattered. We shared plenty of laughs, shed a few tears, swapped stories between brushstrokes, and in their warmth, I rediscovered what it felt like to belong somewhere. I also started saying no a lot. No to Lily when she called, asking me to visit but casually mentioning Carla would be there. No to Sophia when she tried to mediate, softly urging me to be kinder about their father's memory. No to old acquaintances who only wanted the juicy details, not the real story. Setting boundaries became my shield. Not barriers to shut people out, but doors I controlled, choosing who could enter my life, who could stay, and who no longer had a key. I wasn't angry anymore. The raw hurt had softened too. A new feeling was blossoming in my chest, something gentle yet fierce. Not the power of vengeance or applause, but the quiet strength of survival, of knowing exactly who I was after everything that tried to erase me fell short. One morning, I stood before my bathroom mirror and said aloud, "You're still here." For the first time, I truly believed it. I wasn't defined by what Daniel gave or withheld. I wasn't the woman they pitted, whispered about, or ignored. I was Eleanor Grayson, 64, silver-haired, paint-splattered, unshattered. And I was just beginning. After that shift came a new kind of calm. Not the lonely quiet I'd known in my Augusta apartment months earlier, but something deliberate, grounded. A stillness with intention. I kept the letter from Daniel private, sharing it with no one. Not my daughters, not even the handful of friends I'd reconnected with at the art center. That letter was mine alone, and I refused to let my next chapter be about dissecting his remorse or letting others downplay it. Instead, I started mapping out my future, not for payback or validation, but for ownership of my life, my time, and the pieces of myself I'd quietly surrendered over the years. It began with paperwork. I dug out my old files, sifting through every legal and financial record I had, examining them one by one. Bank statements, insurance policies, shared assets that hadn't fully transferred after the divorce. Things I'd once avoided because they felt too daunting or pointless. This time, I approached them with clear eyes, like a woman navigating a dark path with a lantern. Fear no longer held me back. I was awake. I contacted an old friend of Ben's, Paul Whitaker, a retired estate attorney who used to go camping with my brother. Paul recognized me right away. "Ben always said you had more backbone than anyone he knew," he remarked, pouring us tea at his dining table. I smiled, recalling how Ben called me the resilient one, even when I doubted it myself. Paul helped me quietly review what was left of Daniel's estate. To my shock, and honestly bewilderment, there were several unresolved documents tied up in legal delays, stemming from changes Daniel made to his will just before his death. Carla had tried to challenge them, but certain clauses were airtight. Paul revealed that Daniel had set up a trust in my name 9 months before he passed, tucked away in a separate legal entity most wouldn't notice without digging. Why would he do that? I asked. Paul hesitated. "I think he was trying to make amends in his own quiet, belated way," he said. "It wasn't a grand gesture of redemption, nor did it erase his wrongs, but it gave me leverage, not to control others, but to reclaim control of my own life. Financially, legally, emotionally. I used the funds to move into a slightly roomier apartment, still simple, still mine. I gave away most of my old wardrobe, sold the jewelry Daniel had gifted me, pieces that felt like relics of a stranger, and kept just one thing: the plain gold wedding band I no longer wore. I tucked it into a small cedar box alongside Ben's note and Daniel's letter, a quiet archive of closure. I started taking walks every morning before dawn. The world felt pristine at that hour, undisturbed. Those moments gave me space to think clearly, to plan, to release old burdens, to breathe deeply. On those walks, I made silent choices. To leave the past behind, to stop chasing connections that only reached out when they needed something, to build something entirely my own. I signed up for a civic leadership program, something I'd dreamed of doing when the girls were little, but Daniel had dismissed as a waste of energy. On the first day, I introduced myself simply. I'm Eleanor. I teach art. I'm learning to start over. And it felt honest. I didn't share updates on social media. I didn't fill the girls in on every small step. I didn't reach out to Carla, Daniel's old colleagues, or the Savannah neighbors who still sent me the occasional stilted Christmas card. I let the quiet do the talking. That's the secret about healing no one mentions. Sometimes the most powerful strength is the kind that doesn't make a sound. No declarations, no fanfare. Just steady, purposeful steps toward a future no one saw coming. By the time Daniel's estate was fully settled and the final reading of his will was set, I'd made peace with needing nothing from him. Yet I had a quiet hunch that what was coming would turn more heads than anything he'd ever offered me in life. They didn't notice the change in me at first, and that was by design. To them, I was still Eleanor Grayson, the reserved ex-wife who faded away after the divorce, the woman whose name had barely been mentioned in recent years. I hadn't caused a scene. I hadn't demanded a thing. I hadn't even shown up to Daniel's retirement celebration, though I'd been invited, likely out of courtesy. To most, I was invisible, and they'd grown comfortable with that. But slowly, their ease began to fracture. It started with calls from Daniel's legal team, specifically from the estate's executor, James Callahan, who'd been Daniel's attorney for over 15 years. He contacted me courteously at first, then with increasing insistence. Apparently, Daniel had made several last-minute changes to his will, and due to the complexity of the trust accounts, some in my name, my presence was required at the final reading. I agreed, keeping my responses brief. What James didn't know was that I was already aware of the trust's details. Paul had walked me through the documents weeks earlier. I knew about the Savannah house, the one Daniel and I had purchased together before he transferred it to Carla after our split. I was aware of the substantial art fund Daniel had created in my name, described in the paperwork as a tribute to the resilient spirit who turned hardship into a home. I also knew he'd included clear directives that the provisions for Carla and the girls couldn't supersede my claim to those specific assets. They were in the dark, and that was the shift. Power had come back to me, not as a tool for conflict but as quiet certainty. I didn't need to argue or scramble. I had the truth and patience on my side. The next hint of change came from Lily. She called one night, her voice gentler than it had been in ages. Hey Mom, just touching base. I heard from Dad's attorney that you're attending the will reading. I could sense it, the slight waver in her tone, the undercurrent of uncertainty. For years they'd bought into the story Carla and Daniel had spun. That I was aloof, overly sensitive, too fragile to hold the family together. Now the pieces weren't adding up. Yes, I'll be there, I answered calmly. A pause, then, oh okay. I just didn't see that coming. I didn't see a lot of things coming, Lily, I said. It wasn't bitter, just honest. The next ripple came from Carla. A handwritten note arrived in my mailbox which caught me off guard. It was short, laced with defensiveness beneath a veneer of politeness. Eleanor, I'm sure this has been a lot for you. I want to clarify that any decisions Daniel made were his alone. I hope we can all act respectfully at the reading and keep things civil. Carla, act respectfully. The same woman who'd stood at my ex-husband's funeral, her hand on his casket like a prize, was now urging me to play nice. It almost made me chuckle. Instead, I tucked the note neatly into a drawer, not out of spite, but as a reminder of how quickly confidence can turn to unease. Behind the scenes, whispers started to spread. A former neighbor, Clara, texted me out of nowhere. Heard you might be getting the Savannah house back. Good for you, Eleanor. No one deserves it more. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. People who hadn't reached out in years suddenly found my number. Courteous check-ins masked their curiosity. Invitations to reconnect. Veiled probes about the estate. That's the thing about quiet women. They don't stay unseen forever. Especially when the system that silenced them starts to crumble. By the time the will reading was officially set, I'd gathered my resolve like a well-fitted jacket. I'd walk into that room not to take from anyone, but to claim what was rightfully mine. I didn't crave drama or cheers. I wanted the truth to ring out loud and clear, in front of everyone who'd spent years murmuring behind my back, and whether they were ready or not, they'd hear it. The room was less grand than I'd imagined, just a plain meeting space at the law offices of Callahan and Whitaker, with muted gray carpet, stiff upholstered chairs, and a long rectangular table gleaming faintly under fluorescent lights. It smelled of citrus cleaner and aging documents. There was no theatrics, no ornate wood-paneled chamber, just a subtle tension that hung over the space like a fog. When I entered, no one rose or acknowledged me. Carla sat at the table's head, her lips pressed tight, dressed in a navy blazer like a shield. Lily sat beside her, scrolling her phone but not really focused, while Sophia sat slightly apart, fingers laced in her lap, her gaze flickering toward me before darting away. I settled into a chair across from them without a word, setting my handbag gently beside me. My posture was steady, my hands calm. James Callahan walked in next, clutching a thick binder. "Good afternoon," he addressed the room, arranging his materials on the table. "Thank you all for being here. As you know, we're here for the final reading of Daniel Thornton's last will and testament." I watched Carla closely. Her fingers drummed lightly on the table, controlled but uneasy. She hadn't expected me to show, I could tell. Maybe she thought I'd back down, avoid the awkwardness, like I'd always buried my pain before. But today wasn't about her ease. James launched into the formalities, legal jargon, affirmations of sound mind, the nullification of prior wills. I could sense the others shifting restlessly, eager for the part they'd come for. Then the moment arrived. Per the decedent's final amendment dated April 22nd, the following assets are to be distributed as outlined, James said. Carla sat up straighter. Lily stopped fidgeting. To Miss Eleanor Grayson, the Savannah property at 1432 Magnolia Drive, fully deeded, free of any liens. The estate's remaining mortgage was settled by the decedent before his passing. Sharp intakes of breath filled the room. Lily blinked rapidly. Sophia's jaw dropped slightly. Carla's face stayed still, but her hands clenched until her knuckles paled. James pressed on. Additionally, to Ms. Grayson, the Daniel Thornton Artistic Legacy Fund, established to support women over 55 pursuing creative careers, to be administered in her name. This fund, valued at $520,000, is non-transferable and immune to contestation. Carla's voice broke the silence, sharp and thin. "This can't be right. There's got to be an error." James didn't flinch. "All documents are legally binding and were notarized. The trust was vetted by our firm and the probate court." A heavy silence swallowed the room, like a wave dragging everything under. I said nothing. I didn't have to. Then James produced a letter, not part of the will, but a personal note. "The decedent also left a statement for those present," he said. "With your permission, I'd like to read it." No one objected. He unfolded the page and began. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone. If Eleanor is here, she's stronger than I ever gave her credit for, though I always knew she was. To those surprised by my decisions, know this. I made mistakes I can't undo. I walked away from someone who built me up, who believed in me before I believed in myself. Carla, you were there in my final chapter, and I'm grateful, but you came after the foundation was set. Lily, Sophia, your mother sacrificed more than you may ever realize. If you're upset today, I ask you to hold that feeling and then look at the woman across from you. She deserves everything I failed to give her when it counted. I hope this restores some of what I took from her." James folded the letter and slid it back into the folder. The room froze as if time itself held its breath. No one stirred. I glanced at my daughters, Lily poised on the edge of defiance, Sophia weighed down by quiet remorse. I didn't smirk or weep. I simply said, "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to end a story I never got to close." Carla rose abruptly, scooping up her belongings without a word, her heels tapping a sharp retreat down the hallway. Lily's eyes followed her, uncertain. Sophia finally met my gaze, offering a faint, hesitant nod. I stood, thanked James softly, and left the room. The truth had been spoken, not by me, but by the man who once tried to mute me. There was nothing left to prove. I thought the will reading would draw the final curtain. Daniel had, in his last act, tried to make amends, and I'd walked out of that law office with a peace I hadn't known in years. But justice has a way of lingering, like the faint hum of a chime long after it's struck. Sometimes the last twist arrives when you least expect it, not even I saw it coming. A week later I returned to the Savannah house, my first time stepping inside since I left 12 years ago. One hand clutching a suitcase, the other holding my dignity. The key turned smoothly in the lock. Inside, the space felt smaller than my memories. The decor had changed, new furniture, unfamiliar drapes, but the essence remained. The oak floors we'd sanded together, the crown molding we'd painted, the faint scratches on the baseboards from Sophia's old scooter. I wandered slowly, taking it in like a visitor in a gallery of someone else's life. On the fireplace mantel sat a photo of Daniel and Carla at some fundraiser, framed in brass. She wore a diamond necklace. He looked weary. I removed it, not out of malice but because it no longer belonged. This house, once a monument to my silence, was mine again. Not a consolation, but a piece of my past I'd built, lost, and now reclaimed on my terms. The next day, Paul Whitaker called. "You might want to brace yourself," he said. Carla had filed an urgent motion to halt the trust fund's transfer, alleging emotional coercion, undue influence, and claiming I'd swayed Daniel in his final months. It was a flimsy, desperate move and it collapsed swiftly. The court dismissed her claim in under 48 hours, citing airtight paperwork, multiple notarized validations, and testimony from Daniel's doctor confirming his mental clarity when he revised the will. But that wasn't the surprise. Paul went on. During the review, the court uncovered something else, an account Daniel set up for Lily and Sophia, slated to unlock upon his death. "It's frozen now." "Why?" I asked, puzzled. "Because it was funded by a portfolio he hid during the divorce, assets that should have been split. Legally, Eleanor, they're yours." I sat there floored. Daniel had concealed assets, stocks, real estate holdings, and a small investment company registered under a colleague's name to stay off the radar. He'd funneled the profits into accounts for our daughters, structured to ensure Carla wouldn't touch them. It was buried so deeply that even his main estate attorney hadn't known until the probate court spotted discrepancies. "What does this mean?" I asked. Paul paused. "You're entitled to claim them. Not just the trust or the house, but the entire portfolio." Estimated value? Around $1.5 million. It felt unreal not because of the money but because of what it revealed. 4 years, I'd believed I'd walked away empty-handed. I'd accepted it, built a new life from the ground up. Now I stood at the heart of a story I hadn't scripted, where the man who abandoned me had, through guilt or cunning, left me the keys to a legacy he never thought I'd reclaim. I didn't crow or rush to my daughters with a triumphant, "I was right." Instead, I directed a portion of the funds to create scholarships in Ben's name, quietly, without fanfare. I kept the rest, not for vengeance but for renewal. Not to dwell on what was lost, but to live boldly moving forward. Carla never reached out. She packed up and left Savannah within weeks. Lily sent a text. "I don't know what to say, Mom. I had no idea about any of this." I replied, "I know you didn't. I'm not mad anymore." And I wasn't. The true justice wasn't in the wealth or the win. It was in the reclamation of my voice, my worth, and the undeniable truth that I was never the one who was lost. They just finally saw what had been true all along. A few weeks after the court's decision, I was in the Savannah house, barefoot in the backyard, tending to the azaleas I'd planted over 25 years ago. They were scraggly, weathered, but still alive. A lot like me, I suppose. With care, time, and patience, even the most neglected things can flourish again. That's when Sophia arrived. I heard her car door shut before I saw her. She hadn't called or texted, just pulled into the driveway like she used to after college classes when she needed to talk about something too heavy for a phone call. I brushed the dirt from my hands onto my gardening smock and opened the gate. She stood there, arms folded, looking a little adrift. "Hi," she said softly. "Hey," I answered, my voice steady. I didn't run to her or pull her into an embrace. I just waited. "I was hoping we could talk," she said. "I know I should have come by sooner." I nodded, gesturing toward the veranda. "Let's sit." We settled onto the old rattan bench Daniel and I had snagged at a yard sale years ago. The bench cushion dipped slightly but it held firm. Sophia looked frilier, more worn than the last time we'd met. Her makeup was understated, barely there. She had her father's eyes, but today they lacked their usual confidence. They seemed to be searching for something. "I didn't know the full story, Mom," she said, her voice catching just a bit. "Not about the will or what Dad left you or how things really fell apart." "I know," I replied softly. "You weren't meant to." She blinked, surprised. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You were young, Sophia. Even when you thought you were grown enough to get it, you were being fed a version of the truth by people who needed you to believe their side." Her gaze dropped to her lap. "I bought into it. I believed Dad and Carla. I thought you just gave up." That stung, but I let it slide. I'd come to terms with the fact that, to accept Carla, they'd had to recast me as someone dispensable. It wasn't about me, it was their way of coping. Now they were piecing together the reality bit by bit. Sophia tugged at her sweater cuff, then asked the question she'd clearly been holding on to. "Why didn't you ever share your side of things?" I gazed out at the azaleas. "Because you wouldn't have listened back then, and I didn't want to be the mom who turned her kids into pawns." I didn't want you to feel like you had to pick a side. Tears glistened in her eyes. I'm so sorry. For not asking. For not being there when you needed me. I reached out, resting my hand on hers. It felt smaller, more delicate than I remembered. I had to be there for myself first, I said. And I was. That's why I'm still here. She let out a quiet laugh through her tears. You're not just here, Mom. You're shining. I smiled but stayed silent. I didn't need her praise or her apology. Her presence, genuine, unguarded, was enough. I don't know if Lily will come around, she said after a pause. She's stubborn, angry. She feels like Dad betrayed her. And she's not sure what to do with that. She'll sort it out, I said. Or she won't. But that's her weight to carry, not mine. We sat there for a long while, the silence between us comfortable, free of strain. Sophia shared updates about her job, her new place, a relationship she was navigating with uncertainty. I listened, not as a mother desperate to be let back in, but as a woman at ease in her own skin. As the sun sank lower, Sophia looked at me and asked, Can I visit again sometime? Just to hang out? Maybe paint with you. Anytime, I said, tucking a stray lock of her hair behind her ear. But this time you'll have to do most of the talking. She grinned. Deal. It wasn't a picture-perfect reconciliation. No orchestral swells, no tearful hugs, no filtered photos of a mother-daughter reunion glowing in the sunset. But it was honest. And honest was more than enough. As her car pulled out of the driveway, I stood in the doorway, hand resting on the frame, and felt a quiet truth settle in. I no longer needed my daughter's understanding to feel complete. They were welcome in my world, but I didn't need their validation to live fully in it. It was a Saturday morning when I finally let myself rest, not out of weariness or emptiness, but out of true calm, the kind of peace that doesn't arrive in a flash but builds slowly, through months of deliberate steps. Sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains in my new study, a cozy nook I'd transformed from the old spare bedroom in the Savannah house. I'd painted the walls a warm lavender, hung a few of my own acrylic paintings, and set a plush armchair by the window. Soft blues played from a vintage radio in the corner, and I cradled a mug of chamomile tea. No phone, no TV, just the world outside humming gently. On the side table sat 3 keepsakes. The framed letter from Daniel, a snapshot of Ben grinning with a trout he'd bragged was record-breaking, and a hardcover journal, nearly full, where I'd poured out every moment of this strange, painful, and ultimately freeing chapter. Healing doesn't erase everything I've learned. The scars remain. I can still hear Daniel's voice brushing me off, feel the hollow sting of being overlooked by my own daughters, recall the suffocating silence of that first night alone in Augusta. But those memories are like faded Polaroids now, real, part of my story, but no longer sharp enough to wound. I entered this house over a decade ago as a wife desperate to hold a family together. I left it stripped to survival. Now I'd returned, not to reclaim what was gone, but to honor the woman who endured. There was no vengeance in my heart, no resentment, only gratitude for the truth, even if it arrived late. Daniel didn't get to witness my rise, but maybe that was the point. His final act wasn't absolution, it was an admission. That admission gave me back the space I'd been denied. I'd used part of the inheritance to establish the Ben Grayson Scholarship for women over 55 pursuing creative dreams, a project that still makes me smile when I think of the first recipient's tearful gratitude. I could almost hear Ben grumbling about all that mushy stuff, even as he glowed with pride. The rest, I invested in a life that was quiet but rich, not ostentatious but deeply fulfilling. I taught art classes 3 mornings a week at the rec center. On weekends, I hosted workshops in the Savannah house. Some days a dozen women showed up, others just a handful. Each brought a story, and together, we turned grief into color, silence into art. Lily hadn't reached out. I didn't expect her to. Some people need more time to unravel the narratives they've been fed. Some never do. That was no longer my load to bear. Sophia came by every couple of weeks. We painted side by side, talked about life, took strolls down the same streets where she once pedaled her bike with braids bouncing. She never said, "I'm sorry again," and she didn't need to. Her being there was enough. One evening after a workshop, I lingered in the rec center studio. The other women had left, and the room was bathed in amber light. I stood before a wide, empty canvas, the kind that once daunted me. Now it sparked possibility. I dipped my brush in vibrant teal and started painting, no plan in mind. Bold strokes, fearless hues, no boundaries, no hesitation. It wasn't for show or approval. It was for me, the woman who gave everything and asked for nothing, who was left behind and built a new world from the ashes, who finally saw herself clearly. As the last rays of light dimmed, I stepped back from the canvas. The painting wasn't complete, but it didn't have to be. Neither was I. In that moment, surrounded by quiet, strength, and the faint scent of paint thinner, I grasped a truth I'd spent a lifetime learning. You don't need justice to heal. You just need to remember who you are. If you like this story, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what impressed you the most about this story. Thank you for watching.